Imagine waking up to the sound of air raid sirens, not in Gaza or Damascus, but in Tel Aviv. Israel's heart, its pride, its fortress. For the first time in modern history, a sovereign state openly, directly, and without disguise struck at the very core of Israeli territory, not through proxies, not through whispers in the dark, but with missiles, precision, and intent. And the world, it watched. It blinked, then it fell silent. On a night that rewrote the balance of fear in the Middle East, Iran launched a strike that ripped through Israel's famed security architecture and exposed the very fragility it had spent decades concealing. This wasn't just another missile volley exchanged between regional enemies. It was a moment when Iran didn't just retaliate, it humiliated. Tehran, battered by years of covert warfare, cyber-sabotaged and precision Israeli airstrikes, struck back with brutal clarity. Its missiles, not only symbolic but terrifyingly accurate, bypassed multiple layers of Israel's defense infrastructure, landing directly in Beersheba, a core city not far from Israel's southern heartland. The target was not a military base, nor a nuclear site, nor a government command post. It was a hospital, Soroka Medical Center, a site of humanity and healing, a place never before struck, a place Israelis believed was untouchable. This attack was more than physical. It was psychological warfare, designed with chilling precision. The Sigil missiles that Iran fired were not intercepted by Israel's Iron Dome, raising critical questions about the limits of a system long advertised as the most advanced anti-missile shield on Earth. The images of shattered glass, bloodied hallways, panicked doctors evacuating wards, and trauma patients being wheeled through dark corridors as alarms screamed in the night. These were not just scenes of war, they were scenes of a nation stripped of its myth of immunity. The Iron Dome, praised endlessly on global defense stages, couldn't protect what mattered most on that night: the confidence of the Israeli people. Iran didn't need to destroy Tel Aviv, it needed to show that it could touch it. And that message was delivered loud, clear, and with devastating accuracy. In the hours that followed, Israeli news channels blurred faces, kept their tones firm, but their urgency betrayed them. Emergency services worked tirelessly, and Israel's defense spokespeople repeated familiar language: deterrence, retaliation, sovereignty. But behind the podiums, the truth was settling like a thick fog over the public imagination. Iran had dared to do what few believed possible, and it hadn't just tried, it had succeeded. It showed the region that no matter how many drones Israel can launch over Isfahan, or how many Mossad assassinations it can carry out in Tehran alleyways, when the tables are turned, the price is blood on Israeli soil. What made this moment even more haunting was the deliberate targeting. A hospital strike is not merely a tactical blow, it's a strategic message. In war, there are rules, norms, international expectations. And yet Iran's missile didn't stray. It landed exactly where it was intended to. The fact that many patients had been evacuated hours earlier, thanks to intelligence reports, does not diminish the horror. It raises another, more terrifying implication, that both sides knew what was coming and that neither could stop it. This wasn't the failure of technology, it was the exposure of a dangerous new balance in which preemptive defenses are no longer a guarantee of safety. The symbolism wasn't lost on anyone. Israel, the state of cutting-edge military intelligence, found itself caught off guard by a nation it long treated as strategically inferior. And as the sirens faded and dust settled, Israelis weren't just shaken. They were changed. For the first time in decades, their enemy crossed a red line that had previously only existed in theoretical military planning rooms. Iran's strike was not an escalation, it was a demonstration. A calculated show of reach, of timing, of audacity. It told the story that no Israeli missile strike on Natanz could erode. It is now at the doorstep of Israel's own institutions of life. In the minds of many, Israel has always stood as the regional Goliath, a nuclear-capable, intelligence-driven, technologically unmatched military state that could outpace and outmaneuver any of its neighbors. That image, cultivated over decades through victories in wars, preemptive strikes, and surgical operations, was not merely about military strength, it was about pride. Israeli pride wasn't loud or boastful. It was silent, calculated, confident. The belief that no enemy could reach the heart of the country without being intercepted, neutralized, or outwitted. On the night of Iran's retaliatory strike, that pride was shattered. Iran, long seen by many as a destabilized regime riddled with internal dissent, economic decay, and outdated military infrastructure, proved otherwise. It penetrated the Israeli security architecture and inflicted damage not just in the physical sense, but on Israel's regional image of dominance. What stunned observers and Israelis alike wasn't just that Iran fired missiles, it was the effectiveness of those missiles and the fact that they hit meaningful targets. For decades, Israel had operated under a doctrine of qualitative military edge, the idea that no state in the region could challenge it in technology, intelligence, or deterrent power. The Iron Dome, David's sling and arrow systems were proof of that doctrine. But none of those systems, on that night, could prevent missiles from getting through. That failure was not merely strategic, it was symbolic. In that moment, Israel looked vulnerable, and its enemies took notice. The same country that successfully assassinated Iranian scientists in Tehran, that carried out cyber attacks on nuclear centrifuges, and that routinely struck Syria without consequence, had now been struck at home, and struck hard. Public confidence, usually bolstered by decades of military precision and Mossad mythology, began to wobble. In Tel Aviv, Jerusalem, Beersheba, people no longer viewed the threat as hypothetical. A single successful strike was enough to send ripples across society. The invincibility complex cracked, and it cracked on live television. Iran, by all accounts, didn't level cities. It didn't need to. What it did was reveal that Israeli deterrence has limits, and that the game had changed. The question was no longer whether Iran would dare to respond, it was whether Israel could still afford to assume dominance without paying a steep price. Regional powers, always watching from the sidelines, were equally shaken. In capitals like Riyadh and Cairo, analysts began re-evaluating the regional balance. If Iran could hit Israel directly and survive the response, then the Israeli edge was no longer unquestioned. Hezbollah, Hamas, and other Iranian-backed groups, emboldened by the imagery of Israeli emergency services responding to domestic casualties, felt a new sense of possibility. Even without launching their own offensives, their strategic posture had been upgraded. Iran's strike had done what decades of propaganda couldn't. It visibly bruised the image of the Israeli war machine, and in doing so, it recalibrated the psychology of deterrence across the region. At the same time, Israel's traditional allies in the West remained notably restrained. While US forces struck back at Iranian nuclear sites days later, there was no immediate global chorus defending Israel's pride, no unified NATO statement of solidarity, no thunderous condemnation of Iran's audacity. That silence deepened the sting. Israel's leadership, aware of its symbolic stature, understood what this meant. Pride is not only built on power, but on perception, and perception had shifted. The aura of dominance that had once kept enemies hesitant had dimmed. Iran, didn't just fire missiles, it dismantled a psychological fortress that Israel had spent half a century constructing. That fortress wasn't made of concrete or radar systems, it was made of fear. And for the first time in a long time, that fear had changed sides. When the United States launched Operation Midnight Hammer, it wasn't just a display of military might, it was an admission that the Iran-Israel conflict had escalated beyond the control of regional players. For years, Washington tried to keep its boots off the ground and its bombers out of the skies over Iranian soil, relying on covert partnerships, cyber operations, and quiet diplomacy to contain Tehran's ambitions. But Iran's direct attack on Israeli territory crossed an invisible line, one that forced America to step out of the shadows and into full combat posture. The operation involved 7 B-2 stealth bombers, multiple waves of air-to-ground missiles, and precision-guided bunker busters aimed at Iran's fortified nuclear facilities in Natanz, Fordow, and Isfahan. But it also revealed something more subtle and unsettling. Israel, despite its bravado, could not manage this alone. The image of Israeli self-sufficiency has always been part of its geopolitical DNA. Since the 1967 war, Israel has crafted its narrative around the idea that it will defend itself by itself. This doctrine gave it leverage over adversaries and even over allies. It meant Israel could act decisively without waiting for international approval. But Iran's attack and Israel's immediate call for US assistance suggested a different story unfolding beneath the surface. The fact that the Israeli Defense Forces needed American firepower to neutralize key Iranian threats exposed vulnerabilities that had long been concealed behind headlines of drone strikes and cyber prowess. The Israeli Air Force could cripple a convoy in Syria or sabotage a reactor with remote explosives, but it could not on its own eliminate the strategic depth of Iran's nuclear infrastructure, especially not without triggering a full-scale regional war. The American strikes were devastating, but they were also deeply calculated. They targeted Iran's nuclear facilities with precision, avoiding mass civilian casualties while delivering a blow to Tehran's strategic assets. Pentagon officials described the damage as severe, though they stopped short of confirming total destruction. What the US did in that moment was not just provide firepower, it provided credibility. For Israel, this was both a blessing and a bruise. On one hand, American involvement amplified the message that Iran's actions would not go unpunished. On the other, it underlined the reality that Israel's deterrence required backup. It needed a superpower to carry out what it could not do alone. That shift is crucial. It means that from this point forward, Israel's adversaries may calculate differently. They may not see Tel Aviv as the sole hand on the trigger, but rather as a reliant actor dependent on American muscle. That perception carries consequences. In the eyes of Iran, this coordination only reinforced their claim that Israel and the United States are two arms of the same threat. Tehran responded by accusing Washington of waging undeclared war, and while they absorbed the strike, they also fired retaliatory ballistic missiles, more than 20 in Israel's direction. 16 people were injured and the Iron Dome failed to intercept them all. That exchange underscored another hard truth. Even America's intervention could not restore complete safety. Iran still had the capacity to hit back. This wasn't a one-sided operation, it was a dangerous balancing act, and the US was now walking the tightrope alongside Israel. Internationally, the optics were mixed. Some allies praised the decisiveness, but others warned about uncontrolled escalation. Critics in the US pointed out that President Trump bypassed Congress, initiating a major strike without formal authorization. That raised constitutional questions at home while igniting strategic ones abroad. Had the US been pulled into a war it didn't want? or had it simply acknowledged the threat it could no longer ignore? In the end, what Operation Midnight Hammer revealed was not just the depth of American-Israeli cooperation, but the limits of Israeli autonomy. A nation once known for acting alone now found itself leaning on the one power capable of carrying the burden and sharing the risk. In the immediate aftermath of Iran's unprecedented missile strike on Israel, something far more deafening than the explosions emerged: the silence of the global community. The world watched as ballistic missiles slammed into Israeli infrastructure, injuring civilians and damaging vital sites, including a hospital. Yet the international chorus that usually followed such escalations, statements of solidarity, emergency UN sessions, diplomatic condemnations, remained remarkably muted. This wasn't just an oversight or a delayed reaction. It was a silence thick with implication, a kind of moral paralysis that exposed the erosion of global resolve when it comes to defending long-standing alliances or upholding the language of deterrence. Israel, once considered a key ally by Western democracies and a symbol of democratic resilience in a volatile region, found itself largely alone as it faced a coordinated strike from a state actor that openly boasts about its intent to destroy it. The United Nations, often the first global platform to address acts of war, issued vague appeals for restraint on both sides, placing Israel and Iran on equal footing in language that offered no moral clarity. These weren't just bland diplomatic phrases, they were diplomatic evasions, as Iran boasted about its legitimate defense and accused Israel of provoking the strike through its covert operations and air raids on Iranian soil. The global response amounted to little more than bureaucratic hand-wringing. Major European powers, traditionally vocal in defending Israel's right to security, offered carefully worded statements that stopped well short of condemnation. France, Germany, and the UK called for de-escalation, but avoided naming Iran as the aggressor. Even NATO, where Israel is not a formal member but enjoys strategic partnerships, remained largely silent, except to say the conflict was deeply concerning. That was it. No emergency consultations, no expressions of solidarity, no visible diplomatic alignment with Israel. This silence was even more jarring in contrast to the swift global condemnation that often follows Israeli airstrikes in Gaza or military operations in the West Bank. When Israel acts, there is no shortage of editorials, resolutions, and protests. But when Israel is hit directly and with deadly intent, the moral energy seems to vanish. This asymmetry has long been a source of Israeli frustration, but in this moment it felt more profound. It wasn't about a particular missile or a single strike. It was about whether the world still recognized Israel's right to defend itself without being equated with those who seek to annihilate it. That question hung heavy in the air as emergency sirens faded and Israeli officials looked outward, waiting for words of support that never came. The United States, Israel's staunchest ally, did eventually respond, but even that came with its own implications. President Trump's administration launched Operation Midnight Hammer in coordination with Israeli defense officials, striking deep into Iranian nuclear facilities. Yet the initial delay, the absence of immediate political solidarity, and the fact that Trump acted without consulting international allies pointed to a shift in strategy, a move toward unilateralism, not coalition building. Washington acted, but it acted alone, and the rest of the world, once it saw what was unfolding, chose not to follow. For Israelis, this silence was not just diplomatically offensive, it was existentially chilling. It suggested that if Iran escalates again, if Hezbollah opens a second front, or if the conflict drags on, they may be facing it with fewer friends and less cover. the world's refusal to speak up, was not just about this strike. It was about signaling a new international posture, one that is either too fatigued, too cautious, or too politically compromised to take a stand when it matters most. That realization, more than any missile or military maneuver, may have been the most devastating blow of all, because it meant that in the most dangerous moment in a generation, the global community chose ambiguity over alliance, neutrality over moral clarity. For years, Israel's shadow war against Iran had been a hallmark of its defense and intelligence strategy. Covert operations, sabotage missions, cyber attacks, and targeted assassinations that sent a clear message. Israel would not allow Iran to become a nuclear-armed power, and it would strike long before the threat ever materialized. Mossad, Israel's elite intelligence agency, had built a reputation across the globe as fearless, precise, and unstoppable. Scientists went missing, facilities mysteriously exploded, nuclear blueprints were seized from Tehran and paraded on global television. To many Israelis and to their allies, this invisible war was not only necessary, it was heroic. But what unfolded in the wake of Iran's counterstrike revealed the darker, more fragile side of that strategy. The very operations that once made Israel appear untouchable may have provoked a retaliation it was neither ready for nor expecting at such a scale. The Iranian strike didn't come out of a vacuum. It was the result of years of escalating Israeli attacks on Iranian military and nuclear infrastructure, often conducted without official admission. Each drone strike on a missile site, each computer virus planted in centrifuge systems, each car bomb that eliminated a key Iranian scientist, chipped away at Tehran's patience and bolstered Israeli confidence. This wasn't just intelligence work, it was psychological warfare meant to erode Iranian capabilities and morale without triggering all-out war. But over time, it became clear that Iran had been preparing a response that would challenge the very logic of Israel's deterrent strategy. Tehran absorbed the hits, kept public outrage simmering, and waited for the right moment to make its move. That moment came when Israel, emboldened by years of unchecked operations, struck too deeply, too publicly, likely crossing a red line that could no longer be ignored. When Iran launched its direct missile attack, the intelligence community in Israel found itself caught in a paradox of its own making. For all the agents deployed in enemy territory, for all the surveillance on Iranian air bases and command centers, Tehran still managed to coordinate and fire missiles that landed in Israeli territory. Mossad, with its legendary reach, failed to intercept or even fully anticipate the scope of this retaliation. This wasn't just a tactical failure, it was a strategic miscalculation. The idea that Iran would not dare strike directly was based on old assumptions, rooted in past Iranian restraint and Israeli superiority. But the dynamics had changed. Iran had grown bolder, more technologically advanced, and far more willing to absorb a blow if it meant changing the rules of engagement. Critics within Israel began to ask difficult questions. Had Mossad gone too far without assessing the long-term blowback? Had Israel's political leadership relied too heavily on intelligence theatrics rather than preparing for inevitable escalation? The secrecy that once protected these operations now began to look like a liability. Israeli citizens, seeing images of damage in their own cities, wanted answers about how such a strike could have happened under the watch of one of the world's most sophisticated spy networks. The answer, some suggested, lay in strategic overreach. Mossad's brilliance had become its own blind spot, so focused on disrupting Iranian plans that it failed to recognize when those plans turned toward retaliation. The large implication was that covert operations alone cannot sustain long-term security in an era where enemies no longer fear reprisal in the same way. Iran's message was loud and calculated. We have absorbed your secret war, and now we are responding in daylight. And that daylight changed everything. It exposed the limits of clandestine power, the vulnerabilities that even elite intelligence agencies cannot control, and the fact that modern conflict is no longer waged in silence. It is now fought in the open, with the world watching, and with consequences far beyond what any Black Ops unit can predict or prevent. The Iranian strike on Israel marked a seismic shift in the architecture of Middle East deterrence, reshaping decades-old assumptions about who holds power, who dictates terms, and who sets the red lines. For over 70 years, Israel's military dominance had gone largely unchallenged in any direct way by a sovereign state. It had fought wars, faced proxy militias, and dealt with sporadic rocket fire from groups like Hamas and Hezbollah. But the idea of a nation-state like Iran launching a direct ballistic assault on Israeli soil had existed more in the realm of hypothetical nightmares than political reality. When that moment arrived, it didn't just jolt Israel. It sent shockwaves across every capital in the region. The rules of engagement that had once defined Israeli security and strategic behavior were now broken, and a new, far more dangerous equation had emerged. Deterrence has always been the bedrock of Israel's security doctrine. Its military isn't just meant to defend, it is designed to intimidate, to dissuade adversaries from even considering aggression. That posture had largely succeeded through surgical preemptive strikes, rapid mobilization, intelligence superiority, and the unspoken but universally acknowledged presence of nuclear capability. But when Iran responded to Israeli actions not through proxies but with missiles of its own, the very credibility of that deterrence came under scrutiny. No longer was Israel the only actor willing to escalate. No longer could it rely on the certainty that its adversaries would limit themselves to the shadows. Iran's boldness signaled something more than retaliation. It signaled a new willingness to absorb pain in order to deliver it back. The implications of that shift are profound. First, it changes how other nations in the region calculate their positions. Countries like Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Egypt and Jordan had long counted on Israel as the quiet muscle against Iran's regional ambitions. While they may not have always voiced public support, many of them relied on the assumption that Israel would keep Iran in check through its superior capability. Now, after seeing Iranian missiles hit Israeli cities, that calculation is in flux. These countries are reassessing whether Israeli dominance can still be trusted to keep the region balanced, or whether they must start hedging their bets, perhaps through their own defense build-ups or by quietly re-engaging with Tehran to avoid becoming collateral in a broader conflict. Second, it opens the door for more symmetrical warfare in the future. Hezbollah, Iran's most powerful proxy, has long kept its rockets trained on Israel, operating under the logic of deterrence through overwhelming response. But until now, even Hezbollah avoided triggering a full-scale war, wary of Israel's devastating retaliatory power. Iran's attack, however, demonstrated that Israel's deterrence may no longer be absolute. If Iran can strike and survive, why can't Hezbollah? Why can't other Iranian allies test the limits? This logic is dangerous because it invites a regional domino effect where deterrence is no longer a barrier but a challenge, something to be tested rather than feared. Third, it forces Israel to confront the limitations of military superiority in a changing geopolitical context. Technological dominance and intelligence reach are no longer exclusive assets. Iran has developed precision missile capabilities, improved its drone programs, and built a regional web of influence that extends from Iraq to Lebanon to Yemen. In short, it has grown sophisticated in asymmetrical and direct warfare alike. Israel's previous assumption that its enemies would stay in the shadows has been overtaken by a new reality in which retaliation is not only possible, it is politically and strategically embraced by Tehran. Finally, this erosion of deterrence affects not just military strategy but national psychology. Israeli citizens who once believed in the impenetrability of their defenses are now grappling with vulnerability. A population that lived under the comfort of military supremacy is now waking up to the fact that new rules govern the battlefield, and that those rules were written not in Jerusalem, but in Tehran. And so we are left with a moment that has shattered illusions, stripped away bravado, and forced the world to look directly at a truth it long chose to ignore. Iran didn't just fire missiles at Israel, it fired a warning shot at decades of perceived Western dominance, at the myth of invincibility, at the idea that some nations are too strong to be challenged. In one coordinated act, Tehran exposed the fragility behind the iron walls, the silence of global institutions, the limits of covert strength, and the crumbling weight of deterrence. And while the missiles have stopped falling, for now, the fallout is far from over, because the greatest damage wasn't to buildings or bunkers, it was to pride, to certainty, and to the lie that strength alone guarantees safety.